The topic of stretching before exercising has become one of growing scrutiny. One side says stretching is mandatory, while others think you're crazy to even consider doing it. Back in my high school days, stretching before you exercised was a paramount activity. You were practically required to do it, and if you didn't, you were cast out like a leper. But enough of my awesome high school stories, let's see who's actually right. Well, the truth is this is an incredibly complex topic, and both sides do have some beneficial points, but one side is actually more right than the other. Ideally, stretching would technically support and improve the contractility of muscles, making them more flexible and increasing their strength. Really, the effects of stretching comes down to the mechanics of how muscles contract, which by the way is understood very well. Firstly, all your muscles are made up of large bundles of muscle fibers. These fibers are also bundles of strands called myofibrils. Inside the myofibrils are the smallest unit of muscle tissue called sarcomeres, which is where the actual contraction happens. In the sarcomere, there are two proteins that cause contraction, myosin and actin. Here's how a muscle contraction works. An ATP molecule first binds to myosin. Once bound, the ATP is converted into ADP, which gives the myosin protein energy to move. The myosin protein acts like a pair of hands and grabs the actin protein, pulling it inward. The ADP molecule unbinds and a new ATP binds to the myosin, causing it to release the actin, and the cycle repeats. Every time you contract a muscle, this process is happening. Okay, so how does stretching apply to this muscle contraction cycle? Well, in 2013, a research team at McGill University wanted to test if stretching a sarcomere before contraction had any effect on the force that it generated. For the experiment, the researchers used sarcomeres extracted from the abdominal muscles of a rabbit. The sarcomeres were placed in a solution that put them in a relaxed, non-contracting state. Then an activator solution was added, which made the sarcomeres contract. Upon the first contraction with no stretch beforehand, the sarcomere generated a force of 24 nanonewtons. The sarcomeres were then stretched with microneedles and placed in the relaxed solution and then reactivated again. This time, when the sarcomere contracted, it generated a force of 37 nanonewtons, a 21% increase from the previous contraction. The experiment proved that actively stretching prior to contraction causes the sarcomere to produce a stronger, long-lasting contraction. This phenomenon is known as residual force enhancement. There isn't a concrete understanding of how it works, but several theories have been put forward. One theory believes that stretching slows down the rate of detachment of the myosin from the actin. Recall in the contraction cycle that when ADP unbinds from the myosin protein, a new ATP binds to it, making it detach from the actin protein. However, after stretching, for unknown reasons, the ADP stays bound to the myosin for a longer period of time, increasing the time the myosin binds to the actin. This longer attachment to the actin is believed to be the cause that generates more force. The action may be similar to pulling a boat closer to a dock. If you're in a boat and pulling a rope attached to a dock, say for 4 seconds instead of 2, you'll generate more pull force on the boat, thereby causing it to move a greater distance. We now know that stretching increases the strength of muscle contraction. But what type of stretching actually does this? Well, in case you didn't know, there's actually 2 ways to stretch, statically and dynamically. Static stretching is stretching in a fixed position. You extend a muscle with no movement for say 20 or 30 seconds and you're done. Dynamic stretching is much different because you're actually moving the muscle past its range of motion several times. Dynamic stretching could also be called warming up. Static stretching is becoming increasingly unpopular because more and more scientific studies are showing that it does not improve performance and doesn't really make sense biomechanically. This is because sports don't require you to stay in a fixed extension for 30 seconds. On the other hand, dynamic stretching is becoming more popular because it makes sense biomechanically, as it mimics the mechanical movement in sports, raises temperature of the tissue, and increases blood flow to the muscle. If you're going to stretch before a sport, it's best to use dynamic stretching. However, static stretching isn't completely useless. It does have one important purpose: flexibility. Consistently extending a muscle does make it more flexible, thereby improving the athlete's range of motion. Don't believe me? Try to do a split stretch right now. Yeah, didn't think so. Static stretching makes the muscles more flexible by training the nervous system to accept greater and greater extensions by constantly stretching muscle fibers. This doesn't mean it prevents all injury, just actions that require high flexibility, like ballet or gymnastics. We can agree that static stretching is useful for flexibility and dynamic is better for strength. But do either of these stretches prevent injury? Evidence for injury prevention can be hazy, conflicting, and outright confusing. Numerous studies have shown that stretching does not prevent injury. However, these studies focus solely on static stretching and not dynamic. In a study published in the British Journal of Sports Medicine, researchers followed over 2,300 participants for 12 weeks. They had the participants perform 30-second static stretches before and after physical activity. Researchers found that static stretching before and after did not produce any significant reduction in injury. However, they did conclude that stretching can reduce some minor soreness, as the stretch group reported 24% soreness and the non-stretch group reported 32%. So, interesting, but not significant. However, a study in sports medicine did theorize an important correlation between stretching and the sport being played. Sports that require high-intensity cycles of stretch-shortening actions like soccer and football require a resilient, well-maintained muscle tendon unit that can store and release elastic energy at high rates. If players are relying on static stretching, which most still do, they're more likely to become injured. On the other hand, sports with low-intensity elasticity demands, like cycling and swimming, are prone to less injuries and historically require less stretching. Both of these scenarios can give the appearance that stretching doesn't prevent injury. Players who rely mostly on static techniques and play high elasticity demanding sports are more prone to injury because they're using the wrong stretch. On the outside, one would say, see, stretching doesn't prevent injuries. In low intensity sports where there is less required stretching, there's also fewer injuries, which would also support the theory that stretching is not related to injury prevention. More studies are showing dynamic stretching does improve performance and strength and some flexibility. However, injury prevention is still difficult to prove. In conclusion, stretching is beneficial. If you're going to play a sport or work out, use dynamic stretching because it increases contraction force, raises muscle temperature, and increases blood flow to tissue. If you're doing gymnastics or dancing, you'll need flexibility, so do static and dynamic stretching. Finally, it's hard to know for sure if stretching prevents injury, but you're probably better off to stretch regardless. And click the bell to subscribe, you know.